Cindy, hi, how are you?
Good, Yvette. How are you?
Well, so good. Thank you for being on this new podcast, Journalists Advancing Ministry. It's something that has been on my heart, and I'm so glad that you are one of the early guests on the show. And today, I definitely want to talk to you about your faith walk, your journalism background, and how that might have impacted your faith walk, and just get to know you a little bit better. So, Cindy LaFavre Yorks, you are an author of a Dora devotional trilogy, which is amazing, by the way. And
Oh,
we'll talk more about that. You're a blogger and you're a podcaster. So, how'd you get involved? How'd you start? How'd you start the podcast?
well, so that was really I'm an accidental podcaster, is what I usually tell people. I felt like there were things I wanted to accomplish that didn't fit into the genres that I was already entrenched in. And so as a result of that, I got to thinking, is this an area I want to explore? And I'm kind of adventurous, I suppose, in some ways. I'm not necessarily one to jump out of an airplane, but if there's something that I want to do that stretches the boundaries of communication in terms of how I can express myself and impact others, I'm all for it. And I felt like it may be not as true now as even it was a year ago, but when I first started podcasting, I felt like it was kind of Wild West. I mean, I felt like there was a lot of things that were untried. And I feel too that, and I'm curious to find out if you concur, it seems like there aren't as many rules or restrictions. I mean, in journalism, we both know there's all sorts of rules. Of course, I'm not sure how much people pay attention to those anymore, but back in the day, you couldn't have your opinion inserted unless it was an editorial and those kinds of things. But when it comes to podcasting, I find myself constantly asking, well, do I need to do this? I need to do that. And 9 times out of 10, the response is, you can do whatever you want. And I just love that liberation in terms of the structure that, you can have a show that can educate people or inspire people. And my podcast, his GPS for Your SOS, is intended to be very short and super inspirational. And I mean, I suppose there is an element of teaching, but I'm hoping, like you, who have started a second podcast, I'd really like to start a podcast about evangelism and how to tell your testimony and not make it be your father's Oldsmobile. I think some testimony structures now need to be revisited because of the kinds of attention spans that younger people have, and the way that we can get people to be excited about, why we love Jesus and what that looks like in our life, instead of, I was born in, 19 blah, blah, blah. And this is, every minutia and detail. People don't need to hear that. They want to find out what changed your life and how they can want what you're having, I feel.
Well, okay, listeners, that's a first, because that's the first I've heard of this, of your new idea. I'm very excited about that idea, and I want to be on your show because I do believe that testimonies are so important, and I think there's a whole group of people, myself included, who are just beginning to understand what their testimonies are. And actually, that's what I've been talking about and writing about most recently. So yes, when you do that, I am all on board.
That's really interesting. I just want to backpedal a little bit because I like what you said, and I don't know if I even knew it until now. And I have a little aha moment that, really when we compose and tell our testimonies, it does help clarify for us too. And that's kind of a neat added bonus, I suppose, to the arrangement.
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I've been mulling mine over for years, and only recently I began. He's been feeding the pieces to me, and just my human brain is just taking a while to figure it out, right?
Right.
So, you're a former journalist, just like I am, and you're an author, and your book series is so clever. You're talking about the doors, and I always miss one. But the trap door and the vault door. And what's the one I'm missing? I always miss one.
The side door is the first one.
The side door, yes.
Well, the idea there is you're walking along and all of a sudden you're getting ushered into a detour, if you will. And you're like, well, wait a minute, this wasn't really part of my game plan. And the side door can be a lot of things. It can be something that, God has orchestrated for your refinement or development, but it can also be, the result of a bad choice or something that happened to you that you're going to kind of have to go in a different way. or out a different way, or however you want to look at it, into an area that you didn't really anticipate that you'd ever go in. And my personal side door was autism. We adopted a child, my son Max. He's 22 now, and he's severely autistic. And that was a side door that I didn't expect. And so that was kind of what gave me the idea for the book. And back when I first started when that idea was first birthed, if you will, I said to myself, well, I went to the bookstore. I'm like, and this isn't really true anymore, but at least for me that day, going in the bookstore, trying to find a book that was really honest and open about, experiencing pain and clinging to God and his truths and promises. I just didn't really find the right book. And I mean, I do have those books now, honestly, but at the time I felt the Lord saying, that's because I want you to write that book. And I'm sure that you've had moments like that too in your ministry where you're like, oh, no. I want to be the recipient of all this knowledge. I don't want to have to walk the road that's, paved with landmines.
Well, yeah. I mean, the books are beautiful. I love the covers. And I'm going to veer back into journalism. I really do think it's your journalism background that makes them as readable as they are. Tell us about the next two books, The Trap Door and then The Vault Door. So we know your emphasis in the side door. Then how'd you come with the other books?
Well, The Trap Door, that's an interesting personal journey too. But just kind of to summarize what that is all about. You're walking along and it seems like the primrose path and all is well with the world. And you feel like you're, right on God's railroad track and nothing's going to stop you. And then all of a sudden, the bottom falls out. And that could be, an illness like cancer or a divorce, or, there's all kinds of trap doors that we can fall through. And sometimes, like the side door, those trap doors can be of our own making too. But sometimes they're not. I mean, someone important in your life could die. A friend of mine, she was in her early 50s and her husband just went on for a run, came in and died right in the, entryway. And no one, I mean, he was like the picture of health. And I mean, those kinds of things happen to people. And that's a trap door that she never thought she'd have to be falling through. And I'm sure that resonates with a lot of people listening. They've had their trap doors. And my favorite thing to say about the trap door is I fell through a little trap door when I was writing the jacket copy. I had a spirit of arrogance and I did not have a spirit of humility that the Lord has really been working very hard on my character development with that, because I said to myself, oh, isn't it so wonderful that, I don't have any trap doors and I'm through the side door and now I can help other people. And he's like, yeah, I'm going to take you about 100 pegs now.
Wow.
And, yeah, boy. And then I was so glad to write The Vault Door, which is all the securing of God's truths and promises, because I'm like, this is what I'm really up for right now. And of course I wrote that during COVID and I just felt like, that was the only way. Those were our life rafts, weren't they? I mean,
yes,
all that isolation and loneliness. And I mean, even with people that have people in the house, if I'm an extrovert and I really missed, my sisters in Christ and my Bible study and all those machinations that were so helpful to encourage and uplift. And I felt really adrift in a lot of ways. But I mean, I suppose I did have a Romans 8:28 outcome, because that was the time that I needed to really start my podcast. And so that turned, I love how God, turned it around for me.
Oh, and I think for a lot of people, I started my podcast during COVID. I think COVID was an opportunity for a lot of people to sit down for a minute and say, hey, I could do this. Because I've been thinking about podcasts for a while. There was all these things that got in the way. And then there was nothing that got in the way and you could just do it. Mm. So let's talk about your journalism background, because you are a communicator. You are a communicator of God's truths, of his promises, of everything that he gives to us, and the gifts he's given you, the gift of being able to write, the gift of being able to speak. You're using that in his glory, in his honor. And I feel like I'm trying to do the same thing. But
absolutely you do.
There were years when I had not come to this understanding that I could do this, when I was in the full throes of journalism, that was not possible for me. And that's really one of the reasons why, this podcast has been born. So let's talk a little bit about your journalism background. Where did you get started? Where have you worked? And also your faith walk along that way.
Well, I hope it's okay to kind of, turn what you said on a dime a little bit, just to kind of, I'll give you my background in a minute. But when you actually phrased that question, I had a kind of an interesting word picture that the Lord gave me, and it actually happened to me today. I went out on my little boat. It's just a tiny little boat. If a golf cart and a boat had a baby, it's what they would make, and I can drive it, and I love it. It's a very tiny little boat. And I went out with a girlfriend, and I just had this window of time, which turned out to be a little longer than I thought it would be. But anyway, uh, I had my foot in the boat, getting into it, and my other foot was on the dock. And somehow the line, which is the ropes, they call them lines, but it didn't get pulled in. The boat didn't get pulled in tight enough to the dock. And
Oh.
I thought I would fall into the water. I really did. And I was, kind of like doing the splits, cheerleader style. And I thought, am I going to make it here? And these two people, actually, these good Samaritan sailors, came up, and I mean, they weren't really sailors, but they pulled me in and they helped me get into the boat. And they said, oh, I think whoever, tied your lines, they didn't get the boat close enough to the dock. And I just was thinking about, when you said about journalism, we're trained to be a certain kind of a communicator, to be not objective and to report, news. And I had to write all kinds of stories. I had to write a suicide story when I lived in Plano, when all those suicides were going on in Texas. You might remember there was a drug epidemic there, and that was probably the hardest story I ever wrote. And then I would do a story that was, kind of fun and benign, like, food stories. And, I even wrote some fun columns where it was an experiential column where you were like going to be a sumo wrestler and you put on a suit and you wrestled people. I mean, so I kind of ran the gamut, but I think, I can tell, and I'm not sure if this is quite what you meant, but I kind of am intuiting from you that it's difficult to be a journalist and a Christian. And I know in my newsroom, I was really the only one. And I'll even, be as bold as to say that I was probably more of a lukewarm Christian then, because of my desire to fit in with the others. And if I'm allowed to have a regret, and I don't really believe in regrets, because I think the Lord gives us such abundant grace, it might be that, and I did, they kind of said, oh, Cindy's the Christian one. And they kind of patronized me, and I sort of let them, and I guess maybe I wish I would have said, I have a peace that passes all understanding that you don't really have. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them have gone, out here in Los Angeles, people have gone on to great success. And some of the people I worked with, ended up at Esquire and, the New York Daily News and some really big newspapers, and even, writing Hollywood scripts or whatever, very high profile. But, I just always, the ones I'm in touch with, I can see that, a lot of them are pretty goofed up and they need Jesus. And, I guess it's my bad. I didn't try to, help them see that need more. And I don't know.
Yeah.
One of those things.
So true. You and people get to journalism lots of different ways, but I think you went to a college where you either majored or minored in a communication role. Is that right? And then went on. So tell us about how you got started.
Oh, yes. I remember now. You did ask me that, didn't you? I get excited about the high concepts and I forget about like the framework. I actually worked on the high school paper, the Wildcat Tales, and I was the entertainment editor. And that was really fun. And I had some great journalism teachers. And honestly, one of them was so encouraging. And I still have the paper from 8th grade where she wrote, "Consider journalism 2 for next year." It's just so amazing what a little encouragement can do for someone. I felt like she believed in me. And I was just so excited about that. So I ended up doing that. And then, of course, when I left high school, I went to college. I went to SMU, Southern Methodist University in Dallas. And I had a different dream. Well, actually, I started out being a broadcast major because I thought I might want to be Jane Pauley. And that really didn't last very long. And it's ironic, too, because one of the reasons I dropped out of that program is because of all the technology. And here I am now, setting up a studio in my home. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to have to learn it all. And even when I started my podcast, I farmed all that out. So God does have quite the sense of humor. But anyway, then I thought I might want to be a literary agent. So I majored in English and I wrote this really awful novel, which was just a diatribe of all my problems in college. And that was part of the, requirements for graduation. And I think I might have that behind me here, but it's probably more fireplace view than
What's the
anything.
name of the book?
I don't know if I even remember that. Isn't that funny? I don't think I remember the name. But at any rate, then I realized unless you're Jackie Onassis, you're not going to get publishing jobs in New York, or unless maybe you're the star of The Help, right? I mean, I guess that she did manage that. Good for her. But it wasn't happening for me. I mailed out 80 letters to New York, and one person said, "You can stop by if you happen to be in town." And that was like the best letter I got. So,
Wow.
yeah, it's okay. Anyway, then I actually ended up working in Plano at the little paper there, which I told you I wrote all kinds of stories there. And then I ended up going to law school with my husband. We got married in 1983. And then we went down to Houston, and I worked at both of the papers there eventually. And I was a freelancer at the Houston Post, and then went to the Chronicle and got hired away and got a full-time job, which I really needed because I was kind of the only breadwinner during law school. And then in 1987, the LA Daily News called and said, "We want you to come out here and interview for that job." And that was an interesting day when I told my husband, after he'd taken the bar in the state of Texas, "We could move to California if you want." They don't have any reciprocity for all of the licensing. And so he had to take the bar all over again. But we didn't have any children, and, we didn't have a piano or a house or a bunch of furniture. We're like, we're just going to go for it. So we did. So then we moved to California. I mean, it was just crazy, really. And so we've been here ever since then. And then I worked at the LA Times, and I worked at People Magazine. I had all sorts of little freelancing gigs. And then I became a mom of special needs child, and it was really pretty difficult to work. So I kind of didn't write for maybe 15 years, except at community Bible study. And that's where I learned the framework of writing a devotional. And I just had such a heart for that. And I'm so grateful that I just love how the Lord puts us exactly where he wants us to help us, gain new skills. And then I just felt, and I'm sure this resonates with you, Yvette, because of all the work that you do, where the Lord is like, "I'm ready for you to impart the good news now." You've already done like the bad news or the sad news. And of course, we are still in a swirl of disturbing news today. But we really can, as encouragers and as sisters in Christ, to really, join together to try to help people to, be encouraged that, this is the dot and not the dash, and that we're going to go on to a beautiful eternal life. And we just need to lean into those truths and promises. And I just want to do whatever I can to help people to see that silver lining, because I feel like it's more needed than ever.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned earlier when you were talking about writing for your book jacket that you needed to be, that God wanted to humble you, that you needed to be humbled a little bit. And then you just mentioned that you got a call from the Daily News to ask you to apply or to interview. And, as journalists, when we get phone calls from other newspapers that say they're interested in us, you just feel so good about that. You feel like you feel, oh, I'm so proud, right? And for many people, I believe that you just don't want to screw that up. You don't want to go on to the next level of journalism. You want to keep moving up. You want to keep advancing in your career, not necessarily thinking about Jesus or thinking about how that's going to impact your faith life at all. And I don't know about you, but I didn't pray before I made every job decision that I made. I just saw, it's a stepping stone. That's the next thing I'm going to, because that's what you're supposed to do, when you're a young journalist and you're moving up.
Well, and my faith walk is more of a magnet to steel, I think. I love to hear the stories of people that, I'm really exaggerating now just for purposes of making my point, but I lived in the gutter, and now I pastor of this mega church. I do think it's great, don't get me wrong, but I think that my walk was more subtle. And so even though I was a Christ follower when I was at the Daily News, my faith walk was very immature, and it had to do with a lot of things, honestly. And I think one of the biggest things is my faith tradition, my previous faith tradition. I was actually talking to some ladies. I went on a spiritual retreat over the weekend, and I said, "Yeah, I used to go to a casserole church." That's kind of what I referred to my faith tradition. I made that up. I mean, to me, and here's why. Actually, in one of my books, I describe kind of one of the big pivotal moments of my life in my faith walk. I was 10 years old. I went to Christian day school. So, I mean, I had all the background. We studied religion like 3 hours a day probably, and went to chapel every week, and I mean, I love that. I have great memories of that. So when I say casserole church, I hope everyone can take it with the spirit that it's intended. But all these ladies really were in the gym with their casseroles and they were singing, and there's this old time hymn, and I don't how famous it is in other faith traditions, but it was called Here I Am, Send Me, and it's based on the Isaiah verse, and I hate to say I can't remember the exact reference, but I know that verse where he says, "I want to be the one to go. Here I am, Lord, send me."
Yeah.
And all I could think to myself was, how come these ladies are in the casserole mode in the gym and they're not really going out, and no one's really sending them? And I get it now. I mean, obviously they had little kids and they're not going to be necessarily going off to Africa to start missions there. And that was really before too the nature of those short-term mission trips was as popular as they are now. But at any rate, I still remembered that all these years later. And it's just so ironic because I actually did end up going to Africa, but that's because I left my casserole church. So anyway, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but when I adopted my special needs child, I got invited to a Bible study that I'd never been in an environment like that. It's a non-denominational Bible study, and I'm still in it to this day, community Bible study, and people from all different denominations, and they were singing praise and worship music like I'd never heard before. And I'd never been around that environment where people were so on fire for the Lord and so transparent about what they were going through. And really, it was those people and those mentors that really changed my life. And I couldn't tell you the day or the moment or the time, but being around them, and even now, even after this weekend of being around them still, some of those same people, was really life-changing for me. And that's another reason why I think as a communicator, I feel so compelled to reach out to find other people like me and, to tuna casserole them.
Was there a time, because I mean, there was for me, was there a time when you realized that you were a great communicator, you were a good writer, you're a good speaker, and maybe you could use this for the church or for him? Did that ever happen to you?
Well,
And if
yeah, so I kind of didn't finish my story a little bit. When I wrote, my first devotional for that Bible study. So some of these devotionals, people just read out of a book, but at our particular study in Orange, California, the bar is pretty high. People actually work, like we signed up for them over the weekend for the 30 weeks. And people, they really already know what they're going to say. And, they look up scripture and reference and, they really put their heart into it. And they're difficult to write. Sometimes they're even embarrassing to say, some of the stuff that we go through. Right. And that's part of what, God calls us to transparency so that others can come up higher and us as well. Right. But anyway, I wrote a few of those and people were really, touched by them, and also very clarifying for me to write. And one of the early ones that I did that really gave me that feeling that you're describing is, I had a moment with my special needs child when he was diagnosed with autism at age 2. I was by myself for that diagnostic, and we walked outside, and it was kind of a chilly California day, and the breeze was blowing, and we were standing on this little grassy knoll. And just as the enemy does, he puts the most horrible thoughts into our head that sometimes we're afraid to confess. And the thought that went through my head that day was, let go of his hand and you won't have to take care of him anymore. Because I had seen with my older child, he's adopted also, but he just had some mild ADHD. But I took him to speech therapy and I saw the kind of kids that he was going to be like. And I knew exactly, well, maybe not exactly, but I had a pretty clear, idea about what my future was going to be like. And it was scary to me. And so, for that millisecond when your blood runs cold and your heart stops and the breeze feels like it's going to take all your hair off your head, I was like, am I going to really let go of his hand? Well, of course I'm not gonna, for one thing, he's going to end up on a milk carton and that's not really going to work. And also just the fact that I loved him and, I'd been caring for him since he was a baby. And of course I'm not going to do that. But that is the kind of stuff that is really, it's tough to convey, but there is liberation in the confession. And then people know that you're, willing to go out there, that you're really real, and that you're able to say, you know what, these are the things that happen. And instead of like you shoving it under the rug and, coming to Bible study with your starched shirt and, not just pretending like everything's okay all the time, it's just not genuine. And once you're able to convey that kind of stuff in your writing, then people trust you and want to hear what you have to say. And I try to be that good conduit for God's truths and promises, and to admit that I'm a flawed person and I make mistakes. And, that's just part of growing. And I saw something, and I wish I'm going to botch this a little bit, but it was such a wonderful quote. It basically said something like, if you're not embarrassed about the person you were last year, you're not really growing. And I try to remind myself of that because I can be embarrassed a lot. It's okay.
Yeah.
We're a work in progress till the last breath we draw, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So, as a journalist, you're supposed to be objective. You're supposed to not put your opinion or point of view into anything. There's no agenda, which of course is impossible, right? We know that because we're humans, but we try. We're trained to do that. So that's what we try to do. I had a really interesting conversation with my students, and I said, you know what? That's a whole nother class time. We'll get to it. But somebody asked, what's up with this whole objectivity thing anyway? This generation that I'm teaching now, they are very different. These young journalists, they are very different than you and I are. Even though they're being trained the same way, they're very different.
Are they being trained the same way?
Well, as far as understanding the importance of journalism ethics and of storytelling and of making sure that all sides of the story get told and leave your bias out of it as much as possible. I mean, those foundational things, I think they are. But
maybe that's because you're the teacher.
Well, okay, that's what I try to do. But identity is so important for this generation, more so, I think, than previous generations. For me, when I was coming up, if you asked me to describe myself, I probably would have done it this way. I probably would have said, I'm Black, a journalist, and a woman. I probably would have. Yeah. Journalism was more important than other parts of my identity to me. Oh, yeah, absolutely. But that is not true, certainly for, the students that I'm talking to. So my question to you, and maybe that's just me, and maybe that's just
so interesting to me. Wow. Okay. Because that, to me, that's like a pinky nail of the entire hand of who you are.
Well, now I know that. But when I was in, and I call it the full throes of journalism, where I was trying to get ahead and I was trying to, move into newsroom leadership. I mean, when I was really trying to get there, yes, that was a huge part of my identity. But I guess the question I think that these students today have, and the question I want to ask you is objectivity as important as we've always been taught to believe? And in the regards of, should we be somehow spreading the word of Jesus Christ more nationally, even in the work that we do? That's probably maybe not possible in some newsrooms, in many newsrooms.
That might not be possible in most newsrooms.
I would say, yes, most newsrooms, it would not be possible. But is that something we should do?
Well, okay. So I'm super excited to tackle one of the topics you brought up because, as you know, I live out here in California, and so we subscribe to 3 newspapers, which is rare. And there's nobody on our street that even gets the paper. Okay. Mm-hmm. And last time I looked, even the New York Times has like 1.2 million, I think, subscribers, and LA Times has 600,000 or something. I mean, it's unbelievable for a city our size, right? Mm-hmm. So right. A lot of people don't get the paper, sadly. We also get the Wall Street Journal, and then on Sunday I get the New York Times. But I only get the LA Times every day, and I mean I only get the New York Times once a week. Yeah. But so my husband jokingly calls the New York Times, Communist Times East, and and then the Los Angeles Times is the Communist Times West. So you can edit this out if you feel compelled, but I want to tell you about it because so that I actually read an editorial, and I'm not sure, it may have been in the Washington Post because I do read stuff online as well, but it was talking about some of the training that journalists receive, and this editorial actually spelled out in a curriculum, it said it's more important to steer people to the proper point of view than it is to impart the truth. And I feel like that's one of the biggest problems in all of journalism, television journalism, radio, and it's certainly in print. And it's certainly true where I live. And you could ask a lot of people on the street why they don't take the paper, and that's what they'd say back.
The proper point of view. So
yes. So who decides that?
And we just finished talking about the gatekeeper, which is the person that impacts a lot of what people see, that idea of a gatekeeper. We just talked about that in class. So yeah, who's making that decision? I would not, that would not be in my curriculum at all. Now,
but I'm just saying there are people that are teaching journalism that way.
Oh no.
And they're turning people out like that because I'm telling you, they work out here.
Yeah.
And, I just want to say too that, I am a person that, even though I have a lot of conservative viewpoints and I do make a lot of my decisions and, my values stem from a biblical worldview, but I have a teachable spirit and I actually want to read things that are not in agreement with me. Maybe not everything, because I do want to have a, what do you call a filter? I don't want to let so much evil in that I don't know what is truth and light. But in terms of, I don't know, maybe I'm getting off into a rabbit hole here, but I want to have another perspective presented to me. But I'm so frustrated sometimes because I just wish I could go to the truth store and, buy information that was solid and reliable and objective. And I think it's very difficult to find that now.
So you bring up truth, and certainly the word truth is in the SPJ Code of Ethics, the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics. Seek the truth and report it. But the idea of truth, I think, is interesting because I think truth is different from fact. I think truth can change depending on your worldview. Your truth could be different from my truth. Now, what we want to do is seek the truth backed up by facts and find it. And let me just say, I was being a little facetious when I say that we should write stories, in mainstream newspapers about Jesus Christ, because we know it wouldn't happen. But I guess my question is, should we not be ignoring our truth, our Christian truth, our familial truth, whatever that is?
So I feel. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to.
Yeah, I was going to say in the way we communicate information.
Well, I would say even in the way that we behave, and as much in what we say, and also in what we don't say. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I have a really good friend. She's very outspoken, and she says the older I get, the more I realize I should never miss an opportunity to keep my mouth shut. And sometimes that is a godly thing to do. But, by the same token, I do believe that, I probably had some missed opportunities in terms of when people, presented a certain darkness to me in the newsroom that maybe I should have stood up for God's agenda. So I'll probably I may have to do some extra repenting now that we brought this issue to light over the weekend. But I do think that that's what's called me, and I'm sure this is true for you, having been surrounded by that journalistic background, that we can work in a higher sphere, and that we can communicate more of this good news and just in different ways. And, it's more of, it sounds kind of cliche and maybe even a little patronizing that, that we're God's journalists, but I like to say that we're spiritual scribes, and that, the kinds of things, the information that we're imparting will just have a longevity that, yesterday's newspaper never could.
Amen. You know what? That is perfect. And I think we're going to wrap it up with that. That is such a great way to end the show. Well, thank you so much, Cindy. Everybody, go check out her books, The Side Door, The Trap Door, and The Vault Door. They are available wherever you get books. Please check out her podcast, His GPS for Your SOS. Yeah, I always want to say my because I'm like looking for it. Right? It's all about me, but for your SOS.
So oh my God.
And you know what? And Cindy does a lot of great video on social media. A lot of really great, encouraging, inspirational video. So check that. I'm always telling that I admire her for that. So check that out as well. Cindy, thanks so much for appearing on this show. You know, I'm not exactly sure where God is leading the show. I am beginning to see more and more people who were either journalism or journalism adjacent now understanding that it's important to speak the word of the Lord. And I just think that's so exciting. So thanks for being on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I look forward to many episodes and hearing from our fellow journalists and friends.